You're standing in front of two restaurants. One is empty, the other has a line out the door. You've never eaten at either. You know nothing about the food, the price, or the chef. And yet, without any real information at all, you already know which one you're walking into. That decision wasn't made by your taste buds. It was made by a mechanism so old and so automatic that it can override your own direct judgment without you ever noticing the handoff. You'd like to think you make decisions based on your own evaluation of the evidence. You read the ingredients, you check the specs, you think it through. But research on human decision-making keeps arriving at an uncomfortable finding. When you're uncertain, you don't primarily trust your own judgment. You trust what everyone else appears to be doing, and the more uncertain you are, the more completely you hand the decision over to the crowd. In 1935, psychologist Muzafer Sherif ran an experiment using something called the autokinetic effect, a visual illusion where a single stationary point of light in a dark room appears to move, even though it never actually does. Sherif asked participants, alone, to estimate how far the light moved. Their individual answers varied widely. Some said a few inches, others said much more. Then he put small groups together and asked them to call out their estimates out loud. Within just a few sessions, individual estimates converged. The group formed a shared correct answer, and remarkably, that answer stuck with people even when they were later tested alone again, sometimes for up to a year afterward. What Sherif had captured was something psychologists now call informational social influence. When a situation is genuinely ambiguous and you don't have a reliable way to judge it yourself, other people's behavior becomes your best available evidence. Not because you're weak-willed, because in a world with no clear answer, the crowd is often the only data point you have. What made Sherif's findings so striking wasn't just that people conformed in the moment, it's that the group's answer became genuinely internalized. When participants were retested completely alone, sometimes a full year later, with no group present to influence them, many still gave answers close to the group consensus rather than reverting to their original independent estimate. The group hadn't just changed their public answer, it had rewritten what looked, from the inside, like their own private judgment. 20 years later, psychologist Solomon Asch pushed this further, and in a much less ambiguous setting. He showed participants a line on a card and asked them to match it to one of 3 comparison lines, a task so simple that alone people got it right more than 99% of the time. But Asch seated his real participants in a room with actors instructed to confidently give the wrong answer out loud, one after another, before the real participant had to answer. In those conditions, about a third of participants conformed to the group's obviously incorrect answer, at least some of the time, even though the correct answer was sitting right in front of their eyes. This is the detail that should unsettle you. Asch's line task wasn't ambiguous at all. There was a clearly correct answer, visible to anyone paying attention. And still, a third of people abandoned it under group pressure. If a crowd can override something as unambiguous as line length, imagine what it does to a genuinely uncertain decision, like whether a product is worth buying, a restaurant is worth trying, or a stranger online is worth believing. Asch himself ran variations that revealed something important about why this happens. When even just one other actor in the room broke from the group and gave the correct answer, conformity collapsed dramatically, even though the majority was still overwhelmingly wrong. A single dissenting voice was enough to give participants permission to trust their own eyes again. This distinction matters for understanding 2 different flavors of social influence. Sometimes people conform because they've genuinely updated their belief about what's true, informational influence, and sometimes they conform simply because they don't want to stand out or be the odd one out. Normative influence, even while privately still believing the group is wrong. Both forces are quietly at work every time you scroll past a 5-star average. This is where the modern 5-star review enters the picture, and it enters as something far more powerful than a simple recommendation. Psychologist Robert Cialdini spent decades studying what makes people comply with requests and influence, and he identified social proof as one of the most reliable levers of persuasion that exists. His research found a specific condition under which social proof becomes most powerful: uncertainty. When you don't know what's true or what's good, and especially when you're evaluating something you can't fully assess yourself, You default to watching what similar people have already done. A star rating is engineered, whether intentionally or not, to trigger exactly this mechanism. It compresses potentially hundreds of individual judgments, most of which you'll never read in detail, into a single glowing number that looks like consensus. You don't see the 11 mediocre reviews buried beneath the 5 glowing ones. You see 4.8 stars, and your brain reads that as something close to fact, not opinion, even though it's actually thousands of individual opinions from people whose taste, standards, and honesty you have no way to verify. Notice what's actually happening in that translation from raw reviews to a single number. 100 individual opinions, each shaped by a different mood, a different set of expectations, a different bad day or good one, gets compressed into a figure with 2 decimal places, a format that borrows the visual authority of a scientific measurement. 4.8 looks precise in the way a thermometer reading looks precise. But underneath that precision is nothing more than an average of subjective impressions, no more objectively true than Sherif's group in the darkroom agreeing the light moved 4 inches. The number just wears a more convincing costume. Cialdini identified a second condition that makes social proof even more powerful: similarity. You don't weigh a stranger's opinion equally across the board. You weigh it more heavily when that stranger seems similar to you, buying the same kind of product, solving the same kind of problem, facing the same kind of decision. This is exactly why verified purchase tags and reviewer photos increase trust so effectively. They aren't providing new information about the product itself. They're signaling, this person is like you, which quietly tells your brain their judgment is a reasonable substitute for your own. Here's the mechanism in full. You face a decision with some degree of uncertainty. Which restaurant, which product, which service? Your own direct evidence is thin. You've never tried it. So your brain does what Sherif's participants did in the dark room, and what Cialdini's research consistently found: it looks outward for a substitute. A 5-star average, especially one built from hundreds of ratings, looks like exactly the kind of overwhelming, unambiguous consensus that Asch's experiment showed even correct personal judgment sometimes can't withstand. Except in this case, there's often no correct personal judgment competing with it at all, just an absence, which the star rating fills instantly and confidently. There's a deeper reason your brain is built to work this way, and it isn't a flaw so much as an old shortcut that mostly served you well. For nearly all of human history, other people's behavior actually was reliable evidence. If everyone in your group avoided a certain berry, or trusted a particular watering hole, or fled at the same signal, going along with the crowd was a fast, low-cost way to benefit from collective experience you didn't have time to gather yourself. Evolution built a brain that treats consensus as a genuine shortcut to truth, because for most of the environments your ancestors lived in, it usually was. The problem is that the modern review ecosystem doesn't behave like a small, honest tribe anyone could trust. Reviews can be incentivized, manipulated, purchased outright, or skewed by nothing more than which customers happen to feel strongly enough to leave one, typically the extremely satisfied and the extremely angry, with the vast, quiet middle almost never showing up in the numbers at all. A star rating built this way isn't the same kind of evidence your ancestors relied on when they watched which watering hole the rest of the group trusted. It looks like consensus. It often isn't one. There's also a subtler problem baked into how ratings accumulate over time, something researchers studying online platforms call herding behavior. The first few reviews a product receives can disproportionately shape everything that follows, because early raters set a visible anchor that later raters, consciously or not, tend to drift toward. A product that happens to get a run of early 5-star reviews, for whatever reason, tends to keep attracting them, not necessarily because the product deserves it, but because each new reviewer is partly rating against the backdrop of what they already saw. The rating isn't just measuring the product. It's partly measuring itself. So what do you actually do with a mechanism this old, sitting inside a system this easy to game? You can't switch off your trust in social proof any more than Asch's participants could simply choose to stop feeling the pull of group pressure once they noticed it. But you can change what you feed it. Look past the star average toward the actual distribution of ratings. A product with mostly fives and a cluster of angry ones tells a different story than one with a tight, consistent spread. Read a handful of the specific complaints, not just the number, because specific detail is far harder to fake than an aggregate score. And when the decision genuinely matters, remind yourself that a 4.8 isn't consensus in the way Sherif's converged group estimate was. It's often a number built from a system with every incentive to point upward, whether or not the underlying reality agrees. Next time you're standing in front of two restaurants, one empty, one with a line, notice what actually happens in that moment. You're not evaluating the food. You're running an ancient shortcut built for a world of small, honest tribes, applied to a modern system that was never built to be one.